Hello and welcome back to NAS Compares, and today we're going to do a massive software review, and today we're looking at SRM 1.3. We've already talked about this in my Synology RT6600AX review, but as mentioned in that video, I wanted to do a much bigger deep dive into this software. I'm going to talk pretty much about everything it can do. We're going to be breaking everything down into 4 sections. One is going to be the graphical user interface and interaction. The next one is going to be security. Then we're going to talk about network management, and then we're going to talk about that ever elusive USB port there. And again, there's going to be crossover, so I'll try and avoid any kind of repetition, but some things are going to kind of bleed into other sections of this video. The other thing I want to highlight during the course of this is there should be a myriad of chapters in the description and linked on the bottom of your screen. Hopefully YouTube has picked those up. So if you're looking for a specific feature or functionality of SRM or want to know if it's good or bad, whether it's better or worse than the previous revisions, and ultimately if it's suitable for you, I strongly recommend checking out the chapters, because this is a big subject. We're reviewing an entire, practically an OS of software level, so consequently this is going to be a long video, so I do strongly recommend using those chapters. So let's crack straight on. I'm accessing this via a Wi-Fi 6 enabled laptop, and if we go into the network settings there at the bottom, you'll also see that I've got 2 connections to this router, and the reason for this being that this router has a whole bunch of connections readily available, and I'm patched into this using a USB to Ethernet adapter that will connect to the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port, and I'm also using a Wi-Fi 6 card there indeed. If we make our way into those settings, I am pleased to say that both of these connections to this router are using quite decent connections at 2.5 gigabits per second and 2.4 gigabits per second. So we've got a wired connection and a wireless connection, so some great performance connections there. And again, this is just about using the full 4,800 megabits per second available bandwidth on that one of those bands there. And although this is more to do with the router itself, I think that's important, and it will become abundantly clear later on when we move to our networking section why there's relevance to my connection. But for now, let's stick on with section 1. Section 1 here being the graphical user interface and control, and anyone that's ever used a Synology NAS will know just how easy to use this is. You log in via the web browser. It appears thanks to the Synology Assistant application. If you've got multiple connections like me, it will appear in multiple areas. You can use the mobile application. I've got a full review of the mobile app as well, just coming very soon. But again, everything here is very responsive. Logging in is very straightforward. You've got your login credentials. You can create multiple user accounts. Everyone's got their own identities, own images, own wallpaper, access privileges, and more. You've also got support of things like 2-step authentication. We can use Synology's own secure sign-in, or you can use third-party ones like any kind of OTP access there, and of course you can use Google's one. That's the one I choose to use, if I'm honest. Again, all of it's customizable. The desktop here, you can change it to whatever you want. There's a bunch of presets, but you can update and upload your own if you choose. And there's lots of little bits and bobs you can use to change, and also synchronizing it with certain email accounts and email providers for your notifications there to get more information about it. It's a very responsive application here. So for example, say, what I want to do is keep download station here on the desktop. I can just drag and drop. All of these open up very fast, regardless of which one I choose here. And again, this is using a quad-core Qualcomm processor inside. It's an ARM, and it's got 1 gig of DDR3 memory. So very modest specifications, but for a router, actually quite highfalutin. The graphical user interface is pretty intuitive. Like, if I want to see the main list, I'll tap up there at the top. It's exactly where I expect it to be. Even the options themselves, they've changed and moved a few things around since SRM 1.2, and things seem a little bit more native. So I would expect control to be in the control panel. If I want to manage my network, I'd go into the network center. If I want to manage my Wi-Fi, I'd go into the Wi-Fi Connect. If I want to install an application, I'd go to the app package center. If I want to take advantage of networking tools, I'd go to the networking tools tab. If I want to get some advice, I'd go to the security advisor. What I'm saying is, it is intuitive. Things are where I expect them to be, And although there are a couple of areas of topography that I've raised in other videos that haven't quite been addressed in SRM, I think in this latest revision, particularly since they've now engaged the utilization of virtual LANs and creating those sub-networks, and particularly now you can create so many more SSIDs, they've had to embrace a lot more design choices with regards to how things are presented on the network. And again, we will deep dive into the network center later in the video. Sorry, sore throat. But there is still everything where I would expect it to be in the right sections there. Another thing I will add is when interacting with this device, the options you see on screen will differ. Whether you're utilizing the device directly connected to your internet connection, point to point, or if you're still utilizing another router such as one provided by your ISP as a modem there in the middle, options you see on screen will change. So do bear that in mind in the user interface. But overall, that's still pretty straightforward for the system there, and accessing this can be done via the network, but it can also be done remotely by taking advantage of the services such as Quick Connect from Synology, and synchronizing it with your Synology account means that you can access a lot of the controls of your system directly via the network or remotely anywhere in the world, which again, if you are the IT admin of your company or your household, or you're looking after the router for your relatives who want all that free IT support, my God, don't they just, then this can be quite useful for remote accessing and all of that, right the way down to remote accessing USB storage over things like WebDAV via that USB drive that I'll talk about later on, are all accessible and all done very easily. And the same goes for when you want to use that safe access stuff that we're going to dig into deeper later in the video. All of that is very intuitive. If I want to create a new profile, I'll go to the profile. If I want to create different rules and regulations, everything's where I want it to be. Everything's where I expect it to be, and even creating a new profile to add. Say people come into your household, or if you're running a business and it's for staff or a guest, it's all largely there, exactly where I expect things to be. Now, the same goes for if you're monitoring the network. So say you're on the fly and you want to see what's going on with your network. You want to know immediately about the status of things. Say your internet's going a little bit slow. You'll go straight into Network Center there. You would then dip straight away into the internet point there. You would then deep dive into some of the settings, some of the status settings, and just find out more immediately about what is going on your system very, very quickly, with all the options opening up exactly how I would want to see them and as fast as possible, and then giving you the ability to change things very quickly. You can even generate reports, which again are just great in terms of getting information from this user interface and how information is presented in the graphical user interface, with reports being generated directly from the system. Without this being a subscription model, you don't have to pay extra for these reports, and you can have these emailed directly to you and have them generated on the fly or on a schedule if you so choose. It's that straightforward, and again, massive respect to how this information is being presented to the end user. And even if the intuitive nature doesn't seem like it's holding your hand enough, the help section on this SRM help is pretty detailed. A lot of these guides, again, this is all included with the system. It is updated in firmware updates, but you don't. If you can't access the internet, and therefore this is kind of a shortfall of a lot of other routers that I've discussed on the channel, which have help sections which are connected to the internet, which is useless if you can't connect to the internet. All of this is inside the system. So you're able to use these guides to get reconnected, or to learn more about better ways to take advantage of your system and set up the router, tailored to your own network needs to the best of your requirements. And indeed, you don't even need to use that help section. You can just head straight up here, click the spyglass, and say you want to go for a setting such as parental controls. Spell parental correctly. Boom. Parental controls, you've got your safe access down there. So there's a nice, easy, quick using search functionality all built in there that will find things lovely and fast for you, something that is absent from a number of different router providers and their software overall. Now, on top of all of this, I would also argue if you're running this as a business, you're going to want to have that guest account in hand. So say you do want to create a guest account, you would go into the Wi-Fi, because obviously that guest account is almost certainly going to be a wireless connection. Or you wanted to create a virtual LAN network, that can all be done there, but we'll talk about that more in the network control area. But say we want to create ourselves a guest network. By default, there is a guest network setting that's turned off, so you can go ahead and turn that guest network on, and then from there go into the editing settings and change a few little bits and bobs. So say you want to, if you only want this to just live on the 2.4 gigahertz network and not eat up some of that sweet 5 gigahertz, you can set that. You can filter specific devices by their MAC address, which kind of is the identity of most devices. For those that aren't aware, you can link those to be the only things that can access, or they can never access. You can change a number of the settings to it. You can run that guest Wi-Fi network on a schedule. And all of this is presented. Remember, this is the user interface section, and how things are utilized. It's all very intuitive. Indeed, the presentation of that guest Wi-Fi can be broken down to it even having its own customized screen that shows you. So you can go ahead and say, right, I want this specific screen to show when they connect to my wireless network. So the guest portal, this is what they would see. I've changed it, so if they want to connect to the Wi-Fi, I've added my own preset picture of me looking exhausted and sweaty in Berlin a few years ago, and you can have that logo changed there. All of that on the fly, all of that presented intuitively. You can even change how many times they can connect, as well as their quota as well, and whether you want them to be completely separated from the larger network, or to have limited access to things like the USB storage or physical ports and connections. All of that built in, very straightforward, very easy, exactly where I'd want it to be. And overall, in terms of the graphical user interface and the design of SRM, it's not a huge upheaval on 1.2, but you can definitely feel the tweaks, feel the responsiveness, and feel how they've changed a few of the layout of some of these icons into better locations overall. Things that I'm less keen on in terms of the user interface there isn't a very easy to access topographical map of my connections. I can sort of go in and break down in to the traffic control there and monitor certain ports, which is always good. But what I would like to see is a 3D representation of my router and then telling me if certain ports are being used for certain things. So, for example, you can utilize a system of connecting ports together for failover. So using Smart WAN to utilize LAN 1 to act as a failover port for your WAN, I can see this, I'm able to see these ports here, but I want to see all the ports on the system and how they're grouped together. That would have been nice to have that presented, even in an advanced tab overall. And, the way this information is portrayed to you is still very, very good. But if anything, if I was a tech head, which I am, I'm going to want to have those advanced options, and that's something Synology is always slightly swayed away from. But apart from that, I cannot fault the design and the user interface and the interaction of SRM with the end user via the web browser. Let's make our way onto our next section. Our next section is security. This is a router. This is going to be living in the middle of your business, in the middle of your home. It is a safeguard. We live in an internet age, and therefore the router and the strength of its security has never been more important. Now, security in SRM 1.3, again, most of the features and facilities and services that were in SRM 1.2 are still here. They've been changed slightly in their presentation, but most of them are still here, and they are going to be device dependent. So one key feature that we've talked about many, many times is, of course, the Google Safe Browsing. For those that aren't aware, when it comes to security on your system, then you're going to be thinking a lot more about how family members, staff, and more all access your system and your storage. So, for example, if we make our way into Safe Access in the Security tab, we can see that you've got two options ready for you. The Threat Intelligence Database, which is a separate installation in the App Center, and Safe Browsing. You will need an API key in order to utilize this, but these allow the system to intelligently monitor access. Not all systems have access to Google Safe Browsing. Synology were one of the first to add that, and although you do obviously need the key from Google, which is free, and you'll have to do via your own Google account, they do give you a guide on how to get access to that from Synology themselves on their own site. I do recommend getting hold of that. And it's still one of those things that sets it apart from most other brands, the fact that you have access to that threat prevention database and access to a number of those features and settings immediately to you. I've disabled it for this video just because when we were doing some previous tests, we were looking at using some of the filtering of the website. As you can see, you will need to use a storage drive in order to take advantage of that, but overall, it's still absolutely fine there. So while we go through all the features and settings of security, one thing that I noticed earlier on was when we were talking about creating admin users. Now, luckily, this is something a lot of router manufacturers do not do crazily for a router. If you go into the user settings, the admin account, the power user account, is deactivated by default when you set up the device. That is something that most routers do not have. The admin power user is enabled by default, and it has a unique key. Generally, the admin account, there's a sticker on the bottom of your router, whether it's a prosumer router or an ISP router attached to the bottom. The admin account will be active on most router devices that you buy, and on the Synology they disable that by default, which is really, really important. But moreover, you can even link two-step authentication if you choose to the admin account as well as all other accounts, which is tremendously important in this day and age. Two-step, of course, you can use all the different apps that are out there, but what's really good is the fact that you can attach that to the admin power user retroactively. Most admin accounts are active by default and don't have two-step by default unless you manually activate it. It makes a lot more sense to disable that account by default and then add two-step afterwards and then enable the admin account, because between setting the device up the first time and applying the latest firmware updates, there is a gap of time there that it could be an opening to a vulnerability and a nefarious individual. So when we look at how the system stays on top of those threats, and again that comes down to a lot of those firmware updates, we can go into the control panel and then from there check the system tab and see the databases that the system is aggregating over time, and that goes for the threat intelligence database. When it goes to a lot of the Google Safe Browsing, all of those issues are updated regularly, and you can choose to update them manually. As you can see there, we've got new versions, or you can have it automatically check and install the updates as and when. So we can go ahead and install those, click update, and then boom. And again, we can have that done automatically or manually as befitting our own purposes. All of that happening in the background in real time. The same goes for in the network settings in terms of if someone's trying to spam and get into your system repeatedly. We can make our way and make sure that we enable things like auto blocking with someone trying to get into our system, so we can set it up so someone bombarding our system repeatedly only gets a certain number of attempts. So again, the device with its auto blocking built in by default, I think it's set to 5 by default when you power the device on the first time, but don't quote me on that. Having things like auto block, and indeed, even if you haven't enabled those, you can make your way into things like the security advisor. Those that have owned Synology NASs will be familiar with that. The security advisor scans your router and finds potential weaknesses. As you can see, it's found 3 of those user accounts I created earlier in the settings menu there when creating multiple users have got weak passwords, so it's telling you where those vulnerabilities live, and indeed it gives you recommendations of how to set the device up in terms of your overall use. If you're a home user or a business user, or custom checklists that you want it to check for, can all be set very easily from here with repeated scans at whatever frequency you see fit. Indeed, returning to the subject of that auto block there, if we go into the network center and then from there go into the security tab, we can see some of those automated either default or customizable options that allow you to set up a few extra protective layers between your router and the greater world, such as enabling that DOS protection, denial of service. You can change those settings to be as strict as you like. On top of that, you can go ahead and change the logout timer for how long people can stay in, or if they've tried different IPs under a different account, whether you want those to count. And moreover, when we look at activate the firewall, there's lots of preset firewall settings, or you can go ahead and create your own bespoke firewall customization there quite easily with the user-defined rules in place. You can even choose which services you want to enable or disable on the fly, and that goes not just applications, but a lot of wireless network and internal wired network services that can all be configured very quickly there. It would have been nice to have some idea of what these are, maybe a clue tab or a question mark tab to give us tips which of these are important, but still that level of control so quick within 2 clicks of the main user interface is going to be useful. And as mentioned, auto block there, enabled by default, but of course you can change some of the settings as well as change the strictness of those auto block rules and regulations directly to apply to individual IPs if you so choose. Now, when you are accessing the router, some of you may have very bespoke setups. You may be wanting to open up some of those ports for remote level access. You might not want to be reliant on Synology's Quick Connect remote access services. And just like any router, you can look at what ports have been open, what ports have been closed, and change it along the way. You can enable some of these, disable all of them if you choose, or create your own preset rules as you see fit. A little bit more guidance here might have been appreciated for some users. Port forwarding always has an element of techie mysticism to it, and unless you've dealt with routers for a few years, or I think most PC gamers are very aware of port forwarding, I think Synology could have done a little bit more hand-holding here. But all the usual settings and options that you would expect are still readily and available here within SRM. And all of this culminates in terms of security with Safe Access. Let's be honest, Safe Access is kind of the crowning jewel of Synology's SRM platform there, because although a lot of the features and services I've discussed up to this point are available from most other router vendors, this is just something else. It allows you to not only classify all of the connected devices to come under the heading of individual users and create their profiles, but then create rules that affect those users. Much like the same logic they've applied to their NAS users and groups philosophy, the same applies here. So for example, we can look at our list of profiles here. We've created a few profiles here. I've created a profile dedicated just for a NAS device, but also ones for, say, Eddie the Web Guy, where he's got a physical device, I believe a wireless device, whereas my account here has got 2 different devices currently online. If we break in, we can go into this user. We can see that it's a desktop laptop that I'm using, but also my mobile phone. We can attach new devices if I choose under their heading as new devices get connected, and that applies to old legacy history devices as well. It doesn't just apply to currently active devices. We can set a schedule if we choose for that user, so we can make sure they can't access things out of hours. We can say that this user has a certain number of hours of use per day that can then be spread across all of the devices or singular devices if I choose. Then we can apply web filters that allow us to stop this particular user accessing certain websites, and we can create and tailor it with preset rules or customize the rules ourselves for certain websites, such as illicit mucky ones there. On top of that, we can enable that safe search, which allows it to force safe search rules to certain search engines when they get visited by this user via this internet connection, and therefore even if they have an account and try to disable that security, the safe access, this will override it. We can even create customize block pages, much like we had that guest account drop page, where if they do go to a page they shouldn't be allowed to see, we can come up with a customized background, maybe an angry face, a picture of mum and dad telling you should do better, or a picture that says go and do your homework. There's lots of options there that allow you to create warning screens for people that are trying to access sites that you've added to web filters to stop them editing it. But what about if they access a website that is for their homework, it's for work, they've got a legitimate reason to access it? Well, you can set it up with the notification system with the mobile app, or direct email notifications in the notification center of the control panel to allow users who are admins to get notifications quickly to, for example, if a user wants to create a request for a site to be accessed that is currently being blocked, the system admin or the parent of the household can then be notified, and they can on the fly choose whether to allow that website for that user at this time, either universally or just on an ad hoc basis. It's all built in there and it's tremendously useful. Now, that overview, as mentioned, all of this can be broken down not only to individual users having groups of devices that have access with monitoring and reports that shows you not only the websites they visited, if that is being tracked, of course, but on top of that, you can then come up with huge logs of activity that are then generated, as shown earlier on, in those reports that we talked about earlier on, that are generated by the system, and therefore allows, once again, the system admin to keep track of things that are being used by the system and which users are using the majority of the system safely. This level of control, this level of management of connected users for home or business, as well as the analytical information that you can pull, not only in that report as mentioned earlier on, and again we can look at the reports that have been generated already so far earlier on. This is tremendously unique to this system and something that is just not available from any other vendor. Now, once you cross-reference that and all of this reported information, you can also look at who's accessing the system right now. You can go straight into the network center to access the reports of what's happening on the system right now. You can pull that status report, have a little look at the port statuses there, which again isn't quite the topographical list I'd like to see. You can still see who's accessing what with which device and who they're tagged towards. On top of that, if we make our way back into the Safe Access portal, adding new users is tremendously easy. Whether you want to access a network profile or a user profile, go ahead, attach a photo if you choose that will pull from your existing database of photos, give them a name, and boom, say which device they've got. So we've got another router, I've connected an MR2200 right there. And therefore we can now start applying our values to this new user on our system, and we've applied all of that together. And again, all of this can be changed on the fly very, very quickly. There's even a reward system that you can use to give users more or less access, as well as changing a lot of it. You really cannot kind of underestimate or state how good this level of network control and allowing security control of individual users and the system as a whole overall. And then, of course, you've got to talk about Synology's inclusion of the VPN server license, which allows point-to-point, site-to-site VPN connectivity there in between different sites, as well as numerous other advantages. It's not quite as straightforward as a traditional VPN license, but in terms of its business applications, and particularly now a number of us are working remotely, this free inclusive license really does, it's a great little bonus on this arguably quite expensive router. Finally, ending things on the security, we can talk a lot more about that threat prevention now. We've got it activated there now. This is going to be running in the background all the time. It makes recommendations to the system of just keeping it aware of the current kind of internet environment in terms of changing trends that can be affecting routers. And by default, when you turn it on, when you enable threat prevention there, it does two very precise things. Firstly, it prioritizes network stability rather than security priority. Now, if you enable security priority, it's kind of like high-end shutdown mode, which some businesses may really want to take advantage of. But right now, you wouldn't want that set by default for a multitude of reasons. Now, as you can see, You can see the connected devices there and how the monitoring of packets of data being exchanged are allowed. But you can shut down different things or change some of the alerts that will allow the system admin to react to a lot of things and changes to the system. So if you go for event notifications, you can say if certain things have happened over time that you want the system to alert you about. If you go into the log storage there, you can maintain how much space is going to be used for that. And again, this is where it's going to need a USB driver. Some of the more fully featured applications, I'll talk about this more at the last section of the video, they require that USB storage, which once again, given that this router, and I know this is less about SRM as a whole, only having one USB is a real pain, it's still nice to have that feature open to us. The same goes for if you want to get some information and statistics on IPs hitting your connection, whether they are good, bad, or just you need to monitor them over time. This can all be monitored from that area there. With regard to the policies that are being created over by the system, it seems like threat prevention may not be the most finished tool in the chest. It's clearly working, but I think we can expect better things from threat prevention as SRM 1.3 has maybe an odd little update along the way. Otherwise, I'm quite happy with it. I think it's not the shiniest example of things that this system can do, and although it's all there, I think we're going to see Synology maybe do a little bit more with this application over time. It's still good to have it in the tool chest alongside Security Advisor. But for now, let's make our way over to talking about the network management of this system and a lot more about those Wi-Fi connections and how SRM will allow us to monitor and configure them on the fly. For this next section, let's talk about network management. Let's talk about Wi-Fi management, because we've talked about security up until now and how the system has put up many walls and layers to stop the intruders of the internet getting in, as well as safeguarding the people that are in the network. But now we're going to talk a little bit more about how the system configuration works and what it can and cannot do. So in the case of this SRM 1.3, because we're using the RT6600AX, we've actually got a lot more options at our fingertips than most of the other routers in their catalogue. So for example, we're able to create a lot more in terms of those virtual LANs and a lot more individual SSIDs. So in the case of the system and its utilization of the virtual network, what we can do is in the internet section here, we can break down, see all of our active connections there in the background. And as you can see right there, we've got the primary connection, the primary DNS already pre-configured. We've not attached a mobile dongle, although that is a great little feature that I'm going to touch on later on with the tethering. But what we can do is create that failover support. So in one of the ports, we can go ahead and add a second internet connection, which means that this system, if it has a failover or it falls on one of your internet connections, you've got that backup one. And that additional WAN there can be set to that mobile tethered connection. So that can be via a USB dongle, that can be via a mobile, via a LAN cable, USB cable, and using the tethering service of, say, an Android phone. But do bear in mind that the newest generation of Synology router only has a single USB port. So if you're using it for USB storage, you're not going to be able to take advantage of this feature via the USB. So that's not going to be a feature for everyone unless you use a USB to LAN adapter, and even then that's going to get complicated there. But in terms of creating those new networks, that feature that was long overdue for SRM, it's really straightforward. Just clicking create in that local tab, create our new network. I'm literally going to call it new network. From there, we give it its own individual IP, and we can customize that or leave it as the one that it is. Change its subnet mask, but I'm going to leave it as default. There is, of course, the changing of VLAN identity for the tagging there. Something, once again, I mentioned this in my review. Do head over to Black Void for his review of this router, because he did touch on an existing issue in SRM 1.3 when you're utilizing the 2.5 GBE port and a VLAN identity. A tagged identity for the 2.5 GBE if you're using that as your internet connection. At the moment, SRM 1.3 doesn't allow you to use customized ID tags, which is a real bummer if you're going to use a custom setup for your greater than gigabit connected identity in that port. If you're going to use the WAN normally with your custom setup, you're not going to hit that problem on a under gigabit connection. But if you're planning on taking advantage of the 2.5 GB and you're running a custom setup, that is a wall you might hit. So again, hopefully I've linked that in the description, but do check that out. You can choose whether this new virtual network is going to be able to access the graphical user interface of the router. I'm going to say yes. You can choose whether you want this to be completely separate from the rest of the network or not. I'm going to choose not to. If we go for it forward, we can choose whether we want individual LAN ports, those RJ45s, to be linked to this. So if you're planning on connecting a switch to one of these ports, maybe for IP cameras, maybe for office equipment, maybe for the rest of the computers in an office or home, then you can make sure that this new virtual LAN that we're creating is linked intrinsically with one individual port. Otherwise, it will just be its own network accessible to all. After that, you can choose whether you want it to either have access to the greater existing wireless identities, the SSIDs, or you can choose to create a brand new one. So we can go for new network 2. You don't have to have a password. Other than that, click apply, and then boom, we've now created our brand new virtual LAN network. We've let everyone have access to it, but we could have bonded it to a single port. And we've even given this network its very own Wi-Fi network. So if you're using wireless cameras, wireless devices in your home or business, they can now live within this single network with its own SSID and identity, which again, with this system supporting up to 15 SSIDs across 5 virtual networks, that's going to be pretty impressive. And again, if we make our way onto my laptop here, we can see that new network should now be active. So we'll be able to scroll down, and there's our new network 2 running there as our available wireless connection. And you can do a lot of things here on the network customization. So again, we can change some of the settings intrinsic to this. We can change some of the delays on it. We can edit things like the MTU, its identity as mentioned earlier on. You can change all manner of things, whether you wanted to have access via universal plug and play. You can change how this is perceived. You can even change some of the settings that we've done so far as and when you need them. Now, when it comes to priority of service, there are a few little options that you can take care of in the background there. But if you are running a business and you're running voice over IP for your phone lines, or if you're a home user that wants to take advantage of high definition TV that's coming into your home, you can make sure that individual ports have priority of service to these specific and very internet intensive services directly into your system. So that's going to be really, really useful. And again, they can be catered, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of different profiles of voice over IP and IPTV providers there. Let's come out of that there. The rest of the options are pretty much what you would expect, really. They're kind of the usual stuff with dynamic and static IPs as seen there. Whether you want to change some of the client protocol that it's interacting with on the network stuff there, we've already covered if you want to take advantage of mobile network tethering there. And again, we will be looking into compatible dongles. I know Synology has been a little bit left and righty about its support of USB devices on its architecture in recent years. One issue I found in SRM 1.3 at the time of recording, but Synology do say that this will change, is if we move into the wireless connectivity area here, if we want to add mesh nodes. Because at the moment, when the RT6600AX was first launched with SRM 1.3 inside, a number of users were like, "Oh, cool! I can use this with my existing mesh router points, my MR2200ACs. I can go ahead and buy this new router and then replace the existing routers, the main RT2600 with this brand new one." As good as that sounds, there is a bit of a wall, and that wall is that this new router at the time of recording can only be meshed with other 6600 AXs, and that's because there is currently no version of SRM 1.3 for the MR2200AC. So if you were looking at buying this router, this new 6600 AX, to complement your existing household or business of MR2200ACs, do not buy it yet until there is an SRM 1.3 update that allows you to take advantage of it. That's the only real issue I found networking with it. If you go into the Wi-Fi Connect, much like when we went to the network center, that although that manages the wider network, is a little bit more LAN than it is wireless. A lot of the Wi-Fi settings are things you can change. I mentioned earlier on about creating the guest network and the configuration of what you can do on this system. You can force certain things. You can make sure the system only allows certain services to be connected to certain antennae. And again, it's all kind of exactly where you'd want it to be. The level of control on the wireless network, the level of control on the wired network, and the monitoring of all the individual connected clients and what they're up to is all exactly where you'd want it to be, and very, very straightforward. And overall, network management in SRM 1.3, although not an enormous scale up in everything other than virtual LAN creation and the ability to create more SSIDs, arguably something everyone's been giving for a while already, it's still just as user-friendly, if just a little bit safe overall. It's still great to use, but still not going to knock your socks off. Let's go to our final section, that USB port. And finally, let's talk about USB support in SRM. All of the Synology routers that have been released to date, I believe we're on the 4th generation device, they arrived with USB ports on board. There's only one on the latest generation router, which, again, I touched on this earlier in the video, was a bit of a pain. But what you can do with the USB port is actually pretty extensive. We've already touched on the fact that if you choose to, you can utilize a USB device to be used as a 4G or phone internet connection for failover and the like. So having that option to be able to add a device to this, to have that secondary internet connection, or even as a primary if you've got a good enough mobile connection, having that added to the USB port is quite handy. However, I think, as good as that is, that the USB port is way more useful when used with a bunch of apps in the App Center. A number of these are NAS class, and by that what I mean is Synology have clearly taken the care and attention that they've previously applied to their NAS series towards the USB port on this router. Now, it's not all good. There's a couple of things about it I'm less in love with. I'll talk about it later on. But for now, let's talk about that USB port. First and foremost, you can use it for good old file station. That is right. File Station, those that have ever used a Synology NAS will be aware, File Station allows you to access files in intuitive ways. It's not just that breadcrumb white screen list of files that you access remotely. This is a full file manager. You can go pretty deep. So, for example, if we go into Goodfellas here, we can go ahead and we can play that file in the browser if we choose. Not that you're probably going to do that, but you can take advantage of things like the DLNA media server and therefore make a USB drive and its contents accessible via the wider area network. So if you've got a drive filled with multimedia, you can stick it in the router and boom, you can enjoy it on the devices in your home. Again, your Sonos sound systems, your smart TVs, your console, your more. So all of that is accessible there. All of the usual settings that we're used to, lots of the conversion and configuration settings, but do bear in mind you are talking about an ARM-based processor, so transcoding is off the table. But it's more so than that. So we go into the photo section here, where I've dumped some photos on. I'm going to pick a random photo here, right click, and from here I can do a number of things. I can preview this file here in the background. That is my cat. Alternatively, we can go ahead and download the file locally. We can email it if we've attached our email account to the system. We can go ahead and find out properties about the file, the size of it, and more. Change some of the permissions of who can access it. Moreover, we can share this file. That's right. Much like we can on a NAS, we can come up with files sharing on the sly. We can go ahead and add time links to it. We can add passwords to it. We can only add it to Synology router linked users or even online account users. We can create a 3D barcode. All of that from a router is really impressive indeed. And again, if we go into that photo and preview the photo there, we can find out by full screening it there a little bit more information about the file. Again, click in the info tab, and again, it's even scraped that metadata with regard to the camera that took the photo and more. Again, great stuff, well above and beyond what I would have expected of simple USB management in a router. And it goes a little further than that. So for example, if you choose to, go into Download Station, and from here you can add the RSS feed of your favourite podcast, such as the Bugle. That's right, another plug for the Bugle on the channel. Or use the download station here at the top and to start looking stuff up. So if we look up Google, for example, it will use pre-made search functionality to find files, be it video files. Some of them, I've got to be honest, yiffy there, you're talking torrents. So it's all kind of built in there, and again, a lot of those features and settings can be changed very quickly, just like they can download station on any other NAS. There's a huge degree of customization to that storage and USB support that genuinely they really didn't need to include on a router. I mentioned earlier on that if you choose to, sorry I went into the wrong settings there, if you choose to, you can enable USB support and WebDAV. You can actually create remote level access to your drive via the internet, or locally if you choose, or again create WebDAV remote internet access to a USB drive on the router with the intelligence and user-friendly design from Synology. Same goes for indexing, for things like thumbnails, for things like music, which directories and folders you want to utilize. It's all there. And honestly, they didn't need to include this. I love that it's there, and I'm really chuffed that it's there. But they never talk about the sheer scope of how they've applied some of their NAS-based storage values and applications. And again, that applies to a lot of other apps as well. There's quite a few to pick from. And I believe the custom app scene, there are a few bits and bobs floating around. But it's really nice that they're all included. But it is worth highlighting, it's not perfect. With the good comes the bad. I said there'd be a few. And first and foremost, it's not straight away plug and play. So if you do want to access some of the features and functionality, there are certain things you have to enable, like the home service, like enabling file services, enabling system databases that need to have the USB drive. Chucking a USB drive, it's not just going to immediately appear and you can do all this stuff. There's actually a few little bits and bobs that you have to do on the system. Same goes if you're going to use a printer as well, or any of the other bits and bobs and services. So although this USB drive is incredibly diverse in what it can do, it still isn't quite plug and play yet. Another thing that kind of put me off a little bit was when I was trying to drag and drop larger folders. So for example, if I wanted to create, if I went into a new folder here, so let's really quickly create a new folder, we'll just call this one test. Then from there, if I open up some of my files that I've got here from SRM, because for the blog article, I can go into here and I can find all my images of, say, SRM. So we've got individual images there. So if we drag and drop some of these images in, so if we go into that folder that we've just created, if I drag and drop, say, for example, these images here that were sent to me by a colleague, I can drag those in, and they drag and drop in. Absolutely fine. Goes fine. They're uploading in. They're all going in. Absolutely fine thumbnails. Alternatively, though, what if I want to drag and drop a whole folder? So this folder here doesn't have a vast number of files inside. Drag and drop that in. You can see the little green bar. Click overwrite. And now it uploads. But if you try to upload a folder that's got more than, say, 30 files, the system hangs. And that's something I didn't see on their NAS platform. Luckily, it worked on this occasion, but take my word for it from the other video that you did seem to encounter, if you tried to drag and drop larger than about 30 files, the system would have a bit of a problem. And the last, and this is a small gripe, you haven't got Plex, which I know a number of you are going to be like, well, why would it have Plex? You shouldn't expect Plex. It's a router. I disagree. I already can think of several routers from Asus, from Netgear, that have similar architecture to this system. Similar older Qualcomm processors like the older Nighthawk series from Netgear from 2018 or 19, where their software allowed you to install Plex. And you would stick a USB drive on and you could run Plex Media Server. This system clearly has the ability to play multimedia. It clearly has the ability to handle storage. So I'm really surprised that we can't put Plex on this. Maybe there's a third-party like app on Synology Community or something for SRM, but I'm surprised they haven't allowed it, particularly because there is more applications being added. There isn't as many as normal DSM NAS, but it would have been nice to see support of something like Plex, even on a lower scale, for people that can't afford a NAS but have a USB drive full of media that they'd like to enjoy. But that's a small overall gripe in the grand scheme of things, and I still love what Synology have done with USB storage on this system. And there you have it. That has been the full review. What do we think? What's the verdict? Because this isn't the first version of Synology Router Manager. This is technically the third revision, although of course there have been sub-revisions in between. What do we think? Well, I can say overall, hand on heart, this is still the best software for router management I've ever used. Yes, some of the features they've included in SRM 1.3, such as the virtual LAN and the ability to have multiple SSIDs, again, even if they're not hardware dependent, they're long overdue. They should have come a great deal sooner. Things like the lack of Plex for the storage access, even though clearly the architecture is there for it to be done, make me a little sad. But apart from those small gripes, I think they've really improved the layout of certain options to be more native and intuitive. They've improved the overall responsiveness in line with the way DSM-7 felt more responsive. And I would argue that right now, even the most modest, most humble, un-IT-versed user, IT-versed user, I should say, is going to be able to get their hand around this. And of all of the routers that I've used, particularly despite Netgear's hold on the industry and their software still looking incredibly 2001, the Synology Router Management Platform is still the best there is out there. It might seem a little safe in places, and I wish they could push the boundaries a little bit on some of the services and applications, and maybe, add more things you can do with expanded services, or maybe integration with NAS systems and more crossover applications outside of the mobile apps that you can use on both. Apart from that, cannot fault this software and still heavily recommend their routers. They might be a bit more expensive, but understand that extra money you're spending is for this very software. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I know it's been a long one, hence the huge number of chapters that I hope you've used to navigate this. I know there are shorter videos out there, but again, this was about covering the full SRM, not just updates on SRM 1.2 to 1.3. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Click like if you have. It helps me know that I'm doing right. Click subscribe if you want to learn more. Use the free advice section over at NAS Compares. Use the links in the description for the reviews, or if you want to buy the router for yourself, it will support the channel if you use the links. Other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.